All right, good evening. I hope all of you are doing fantastically well. We are learning tonight Maseches Eruvin, Daf Yud Aleph, a Geshmak Daf Baruch Hashem with a lot of meat. We're going to be going to the Mishnah toward the bottom of Daf Yud Aleph from the Beis, and our starting point tonight is a little bit more than halfway down on Yud Amud Beis, and let us jump right in with a very unique sugya in some ways. It's kind of hard to understand some of the Maseches, which was the toilets of the rich and famous. Nowadays, it's just, six of one or half a dozen of the other. There's only so many features a toilet can have. Okay, there are some bells and whistles, but by and large, a toilet is a toilet. But back in the day, that wasn't the case. And let's get started just a little bit more than halfway down on Yud Aleph, on Yud Beis, Yud Amud Beis, says the Gemara Tanan. There is a Mishnah that writes Hasam over there, or ha'asla, the leather on top of a toilet. They would have a seat of some kind, a smaller seat, and there would be leather that would be tightened across the top with a hole in it for one to be able to go to the bathroom. So, or ha'asla v'chalal shalom mitzdarfen b'tefach. So we say that even though if you were to look at the diameter of this barrel where there's leather on the top to go to the bathroom, even though there's some parts that are leather and some parts that are holes. So says the Gemara, we are mitzdaref betefach. We do add all of that up to equal a tefach. What does this have to do with anything? And the answer to that is because is there any tumas ohel underneath there? And the reason why that's valuable is because as we learned, I believe, I can't remember where anymore, and maybe in Maseches Shabbos, maybe in Brachos, I remember the case where we were discussing about a question of tumas ohel, where that which was above the person and the mace was only a tefach wide. That's the minimum shear. So our question that's being asked here tonight is whether or not it's reasonable to assume that the or ha'asla, the leather on top of this particular toilet, and Rashi highlights this was from Malachim, it was kind of a nicer, higher end model. So that's the question here: is if there is a hole and then pieces of leather, but in aggregate, the actual pieces of leather don't total a tefach, but with space they might. So how do we look at all of that? That's what the Gemara is dealing with here. So first of all, says the Gemara, my or ha'asla, what is the leather of a toilet? Amar Rabbi bar bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, or kisu shel beis hakisei, it's a leather covering for a bathroom. Vikama, says the Gemara, how much are we talking about? And here we're going to see a very, very nuanced discussion about shiurim. Says the Gemara, ki asa Rav Dini Omar, this fancy toilet was made relatively small. Etzba'ayim mikan ve'etzba'ayim mikan ve'etzba'ayim revach ba'emtza. The whole thing was one tefach. The whole thing was one tefach is going to be 6 finger breadths. There's a very important Rashi here that's helpful for us. It's Rashi, the first of the widest lines of Rashi. Dibur hamasko b'kama, says Rashi, b'kama yehei nekev, remember what we're asking about is, can we get in aggregate a tefach even though there isn't a tefach of cloth, even though there isn't a tefach of fabric? So that's what's going on here. B'menachos perek tcheles aminan tefach deoraisa daled begodel chamesh be'etzba shis bezutrasi. The way we can get to a tefach is by 4 thumb widths, 5 finger widths, and 6 zutrasi, 6 pinky widths. That's what Rashi says here. And if you use this as your given for our math problems tonight, that will help to understand many of the lines that follow. So says the Gemara, that was the Shita number 1 that we learned, which was the Shita of Rav Dimi. And Rav Dimi said 2 etzbaos going all the way across. Ki asa Ravin said, Amar, no, etzbao mechza mikan, 1.5 etzbaos on one side, the etzba mechza mikan, and 1.5 on the other side, the etzba revach ba'emtza, and only 1 in the middle. And he had a little bit more of a machmir shita, where the middle, the hole in the middle couldn't be at the same size as the ones on the outside, but it had to be a smaller shear. So we'll have to see, are they actually arguing? In fact, Amar le Abaye le Rav Dimi mi pligisu. Are you guys arguing? I'm not so clear on how these shitas work out. Amar le lo. Habirav rivasa, habizutrasa, the low pligin. We're just using different measuring spoons. If you say that there's a tablespoon, or if you say that there's 3 teaspoons, that's not a machlokas. You're just standing at a different vantage point. You have different measuring tools. So here too, the same is true. One of us is using a bigger finger. One of us is using a smaller finger. So says the Gemara, I don't buy it. Amar le, lie. According to what you just said, Pligisu, you are arguing. And here's what you're arguing about, says Abaye. It's just a funny conversation where Abaye is telling them that they're arguing, and even though they don't know that they're arguing. How did that work out? What does Abaye think that they're arguing about? Uva omed meruba al haparos mishtei ruchos pligisu. What they're arguing about is whether or not we're allowed to take solid from both sides of a whole and enclose them and include them in the math. Are we allowed to do that, or does the whole separate them in too sharply of a way where we would not have omed meruba al haparot? So that's what the answer is. L'didach, he says to Rav Dimi, l'didach have omed. For you, it's going to be considered proper, but l'Ravin beruach achas have omed mishtei ruchos lo have omed. And that's another reason why Ravin had a more lenient shita to lower the volume of the middle so that it wouldn't be equivalent to the sides, because otherwise this would not have worked out for him, because he holds that it's only miruach achas. You can only begin to add things in from one side and not from both. So that's why he had to make the hole in the middle a little bit smaller. If, says Abaye to Rav Dimi, if you want to argue that you're not having a machlokes, then Ravin hachi baile the meimar. Then it should have been the case that Ravin should have said something else. We saw in our Gemara, what did Ravin say? So if we look back a little bit higher, Ravin said it's 1.5 etzbaos on one side, 1.5 on the other, and 1 etzba in the middle of the leather in the toilet. That's what Ravin said. However, if you're telling me that they're the same shita and there's no machlokes, then the math doesn't work. What should he have said? Etzba ushlish mikan, be'etzba ushlish mikan, be'etzba ushlish rebach be'emsa. If you're trying to match the shitas and you just said that there's different hand measurements, so then why? Look at shita number 1 of Rav Dimi. All 3 measurements were the same. The first piece of leather, the opening, and the second piece of leather were the same. But then Ravin comes along and says the first piece of leather and the other piece of leather are the same, but the hole's a different size, which means that they're not the same. So if you wanted to say that there was no argument, then Ravin should have had to restructure his answer. So it says the Gemara, Elamai Peliginon. The other option is to say that we are arguing, and if that's true, then says Rav Dimi, then I would have had to say something different. Then l'didi hachi baili l'meimar, I would have had to say something else, which is etzba shnei shlishim mikan. It should have been 1 2/3 from one side, ve'etzba shnei shlishim mikan, and 1 2/3 from the other, ve'etzba'ayim ushnei shlishim rebach ba'emsa. And I should have left 2 2/3 in the middle. So it can't be that they're arguing because he did not say that. So therefore, the Gemara is torn. So it says what Rav Dimi finally says back to Abaye is that, listen, I wasn't intending to have a machlokes. That wasn't my goal when I was speaking with Ravin about the topic of the Or HaAsla, with how to parse out the leather on the top of this seat of this barrel when one goes to the bathroom. If it is in fact the case that there was something, a subtext to our conversation that I missed, and we were arguing, then it's beparos ke'omed palginon. Then what we're probably arguing about is when it's exactly half or and half open. Let's say that there's half leather and exactly half open. What would be the din in that case? So then we would be able to look back at their shitas that we saw earlier and see that we can see who the lenient one is and who the strict one is. We could see that Rav Dimi was going to be more lenient, and that Ravin would have been a little bit more strict to say that if it was mamish ke'omed, parutz ke'omed, then it would not be kosher. So that's the story with the toilet, a little bit out of left field as we began to deal with the strange measurements of this, but connected, of course, in regards to how we view the concept of parutz meruba al ha'omed or omed meruba al ha'parutz, something that we're going to speak about at length tonight. Just interesting to note that is how the Gemara tries to play this out in regards to the Or HaAsla. Says the Gemara at the 2 dots toward the bottom of Yud Amud Beis, 4 lines from the bottom. We said in our Mishnah on Daf Beis, the Mishnah writes there, that if there is a tzuras HaPesach, a formal doorway, meaning there's 2 posts with a beam that goes across the top, we'll speak a little bit more about the scope of that tonight, then even though the hole in the wall of the Mavi may be greater than 10 amos, but still the tzuras HaPesach is a trump card. Now many blot ago, we learned about an amaltera, if that rings a bell. That was machlokes in the Gemara. What that was it cedar above the doorways of the Heichal and possibly the Ulam as well? Or was it some type of decorative carve out of birds in that, which we saw in the Gemara, which is two different shitas? Nevertheless, we did learn about that as it related to the Ulam, about the Amaltara. And here's the Gemara's question as it relates to that. Says the Gemara, Ashkechan Tzuras HaPesach, the Mahanya Berachvo. We've seen that a Tzuras HaPesach can help in a lateral break, right to left, in a horizontal break. The Amaltara, the Mahanya Begofo. And we know that in Amaltara, these beams or these bird cutouts in the wood can help with something in regards to their height. But can we use these two tools in different directions? Can we use a Tzuras HaPesach not for a length problem, not for a horizontal problem, but for a vertical problem? And can we use an Amaltara de Mahanya Begofo, says the Gemara on the top of Daf Yud Aleph Amud Aleph, Ibchamai? What would we do if we reversed them? Would these tools in our arsenal of trying to solve problems with an Eruv, would these tools work if they were reversed? So that's the Gemara's question. The Gemara answers fairly cleanly. Top of Daf Yud Aleph Amud Aleph, top line, says the Gemara, Tashma, we learn in the Tanaim, the Tanya, a Brisa writes, Mavui shehu gavoa me'esrim ama yema'et, v'im yesh lo tzuras ha'pesach eino tzarach lema'et. If you have a mavui that's more than 20 amos, you have to lower it. I should say more accurately, if it is 20 amos or more, then you should lower it. V'im yesh lo tzuras ha'pesach eino tzarach lema'et. There we see black on white that a tzuras ha'pesach, while normally works for something horizontal, here we see that it works even for something vertical. A tzuras ha'pesach is sufficient for a mavui, provided that it's, I should say not provided, but even if it's more than 20 amos off the ground. However, Amaltara berachbo mai, what would we say about an Amaltara? We know that it's typically used for the vertical axis, but would it also be worthwhile to use for the horizontal axis, for the x-axis? So says the Gemara, Amaltara berachbo mai, says the Gemara, Toshma. Let's see, this price is not so simple to know how we apply a Amaltara, but let's see how it plays out. Says the Gemara, 4 lines down in Yud Aleph Amud Aleph, the Tanya, Mavui shugavo me'esrim amo yemait. That we know, a Mavui that's 20 amos or taller, you have to lower it. The Harocha me'esr yemait. So that was the first, was the vertical, and here we're on the horizontal. The Harocha me'esr yemait. V'im yesh lo tzuras ha'pesach, eino tzarech lema'et. So here we have two different areas. We've spoken about the horizontal and the vertical, and seemingly we have listed in this brisa two different possible leniencies. One is to build a tzuras ha'pesach, in which case we would not then be obligated to minimize whatever the gap is. And the second is to use an amaltara. Now, what the Gemara doesn't detail is which of the first two parts of this Mishnah is it going on. Is it talking about the case of the height, or is it talking about the case of the width? So says the Gemara, my lava seifa, doesn't this look like we're talking about the second part of the Mishnah, which is when it listed utilizing the tools in our toolkit of Tzuras HaPesach and Amaltara, in which case we see that Amaltara applies even for width and not only for height, beautiful, like we were looking for. Says the Gemara, lo aresha lav dafka. Maybe when this brisa said that an amaltara is useful to prevent someone from having to minimize a gap, it's only true by the vertical and not true by the horizontal. So therefore, we cannot make the diuk that we were hoping for. Says the Gemara, this is the Gemara that we learned already on Daf Beis, about one of the various versions of how we learn our Mishnah, as to whether or not a Tzuras HaPesach is actually helpful beyond 10. And we saw a shita of Rav that we're going to quote again now, that Rav was of the opinion that our Mishnah had a mistake in its language, that when it said v'harachav me'eser amos, that if there was a pirza, a break in the wall of a mavui that was greater than 10, you had to be mama'et, even if there was a Tzuras HaPesach. Let's learn that again right here. Masni lo Rabbi Yehuda l'chia barav kame de Rav, ein tzarech lama'et. Our Mishnah, like we have it, that if you have a Tzuras HaPesach beyond the break of 10, so then you don't need to minimize the gap. However, Amar le asniye, what should our Mishnah have actually taught? Tzarech lama'et. Our Mishnah should have taught the din that one is obligated to lower, to minimize the 10 amma horizontal gap in the mavui wall, even if there's a Tzuras HaPesach. So from this, Rav Yosef wants to make a tzushtel, he wants to jump and try to gain a little bit of traction with a new idea. Let's see what that new idea is. Amar Rav Yosef, Midivrei Rabbeinu, from the Shita of Rab, Nilmad Chatzer Sheruba Psachim Mechalonos, Eina Niteres B'Tzuras HaPesach. Maybe just like Rav taught us that a Tzuras HaPesach does not work when a Mavui has a break that's 10 amos or greater, maybe we'd say the same thing in regards to the wall of a Chatzer, that Ruba, the majority of it is Psachim, openings, Vachalonos, and windows. So maybe there we would have said, Eina Niteres B'Tzuras HaPesach. Maybe we would have said that wall of the Chatzer is insufficient, and one needs to make sure that they do something. But this is where Rav Yosef is trying to add to Rav. Maybe just like Rav is saying that the Tzuras HaPesach doesn't work by a 10 plus foot gap in a Mavui wall, so too it wouldn't apply in this case either, where it's a Chatzer wall with these various windows and openings. So says the Gemara, my taima, why did Rav Yosef assume that this was the case? Because just like since when there is a greater than 10 amma break in a wall of a mavui, uparitz meruba al ha'omeid oser b'chatzer, and at the same time we also have a rule that paritz is meruba al ha'omeid, that where the open space is greater than the closed space, we would forbid it in a chatzer, that wall would not work, which is basically what we're discussing, all these openings and windows in the chatzer. So therefore, argues Rav Yosef, just like yoser me'eser ha'oser b'mavui, ein nitar b'tzuras ha'pesach. We said that by a mavui, of course, that's what Rav was saying initially, that we cannot use a tzuras ha'pesach by a wall that has in excess of a break of 10 amos. So too, when it comes to one of the inherent challenges of a chatzer, that if it's parutz meruba al ha'omed, that if the break in the wall of the chatzer is greater than the wall space of the chatzer, so then af parutz meruba al ha'omed ha'oser b'chatzer eino nitar b'tzuras ha'pesach. Maybe there too, argues Rav Yosef, we could make a tzushtal from the shita of Rav that we should say that just like it's true in the case of mavui, like Rav said that the Tzuras HaPesach doesn't help for the Mavui that's as a whole of greater than 10, so too, by a Chatzer that's made up of windows and openings, maybe the Tzuras HaPesach won't help there either. The Gemara doesn't like this on many fronts. We end up not accepting the sheet of Rabbi Yosef, and here's why. Ma'ali Yosef, this is what the Gemara argues back a little bit more than a third of the way down on Yud Aleph, Amud Aleph. Says the Gemara, no. Ma'ali Yosef me'eser ha'oser b'mavui. But when it comes to the Mavui, where Rav said that the Tzuras HaPesach doesn't help when the breach is greater than 10, Shekain lo hitartabo etzel pasei biros l'Rav Meir, we would not have allowed this solution of Tzuras HaPesach in regards to pasei biros. Tomer b'parutz meruba al ha'omed, one might have argued in regards to parutz meruba al ha'omed ha'oser b'chatzer Shekain hitarta etzel pasei biros l'divrei Yaakov. At least we have a precedent of parutz meruba al ha'omed, not by a mavui, but maybe by a chatzer, maybe we do have this space where it's permissible to do that, because as we learned about yesterday, and as are found in several Mishnayos and Shas, this concept of pasei biros is a critical one. It's a critical concept where Chazal created an infrastructure where one is allowed to carry, even though it's parutz meruba al ha'omed, even though the open space is greater than the closed up space. So maybe we should have argued that by mavui we would never allow for such a thing. But pasei biros is more similar to a chatzer. In a chatzer you can carry whatever you want. In pasei biros you can carry whatever you want. So says the Gemara back to Rav Yosef, you're trying to make a jump from the world of mavui to the world of chatzer, and says the Gemara, I'm telling you that that's not comparable. The world of mavui is not always similar to the world of chatzer, because one of the features of chatzer, which is the parutz meruba al ha'omed feature, is something that exists by pasei biros, which is similar, maybe too similar, to the world of chatzer, and therefore we cannot make the comparison. Nevertheless, the Gemara is going to try to bring a Mari Makom to show that maybe Rav Yosef is right. What is that Mari Makom? Lema, maybe we should say halfway down Yud Aleph Amud Aleph, Lema Misayele, maybe this would support the sheet of Rav Yosef that a Tzuras HaPesach would not work even in a chatzer. Tefanos halalu sheruban psachim v'chalonos muter, that if you have these walls which are mostly made up of psachim and chalonos muter, ubilvad shehei amud omeid meruba al haparutz, only if, in fact, it's omed meruba al haparot. What is the backhanded inference from that? The backhanded inference is that had it been parotz meruba al omed instead, that you would have no solution, that a tzuras pesach would not work. But even before we get to the meaty part of this, which is that maybe Rav Yosef has a precedent in a Tanaic source, but the Gemara has a problem inherently. Listen to the language that we just read. The brisa that we just read says, "Tefanos halalu sheruban psachin." We said that the walls are mostly open and windows, and then we said it has to be ubilvad, that it's omed meruba al haparos, that it has more solid space than see-through space. That's a stira minei ubei. That's an internal contradiction in this Mari Makom. You can't say that the majority of the space of the wall of the Chatzar is open, but just make sure that the majority of the wall of the Chatzar has physical space. Those two things don't work. Says the Gemara, Sheruban Salka Daitach. Really, the majority of the wall is covered by windows and by doors, but then you can't have Omed Merubah Paras. The way you built the case is impossible. The two things can't coexist. So answers the Gemara, you're right. Ela'ima, what this source in the Tanaim should say, Ela'ima sheriba behem psachim v'chalomas. There are just a lot of them, but it's less than 50% of the wall of the Chatzar, and therefore that's not a problem. And that's what the Gemara's question is asking here, is maybe we could say that this is a good support for the Shita of Rav Yosef. Says the Gemara, Amar Rav Kahana, absolutely not. Kitanya Hahi, that brisa where we said that it's permissible to use that wall of a Chatzar, where we had the inference that had it been Paretz Meruba al Ha'omed, that you cannot use the Tzuras HaPesach, like Rav Yosef wanted to say. Says the Gemara, Amar Rav Kahana, Kitanya Hahi, and that brisa, B'Pischei Shimoi. Those walls those openings were very bad openings. Says Rashi, 1.5 inches, 2 inches above where we are. Dibur Hamaschil Pischei Shimoi, Psachin Shomemin, Lishnachrina, Psachin Mikul Kalin. What we're talking about here is a door that is no longer functioning properly, like, says Rashi, an old person is no longer remembering everything that he learned. Okay, what is this Pischa Shimai in detail? We know the concept that they're not good openings. Says the Gemara, My Pische Shimai, Pligiba Rav Rechumi v'Rav Yosef. This was a machlokas in the Amoraim between Rav Rechumi and Rav Yosef. Chad Amar Delays lahu shekafe. It's missing some of its bricks. Rashi points this out on the side. Mezuzos shenechletzu avnehem mikan umikan. Some of the bricks are coming out of the door jamb. Avechad amar delays lahu tikra. Some say that there's no top to the door. Either way, that's how the Gemara says that this brisa is no longer a support for Rav Yosef. And it's interesting because the next line of the Gemara is historically strange because it says, "V'af Rav Yochanan savar la lahadirav." Lahadirav the Amar. Let's just take this line first. Even Rav Yochanan was going to follow the opinion of Rav. Now, you need to know a little bit of the flow of history here because it sounds a little pachin panim right now to say that we're following the Shita of Rav Yochanan in the face of Rav Yosef right after we taught Rav Yosef. But historically speaking, you have to see the flow. Rav and Rav Yochanan lived at the same time. Rav Yosef was 1.5 generations, 2 generations later. If Rav Yosef was alive during the lifetime of Rav Yochanan, he was a tiny little boy, but he was certainly not paskening shilas like this. So the Gemara is not being disrespectful to Rav Yosef. It's just going back in time to say that even Rav Yochanan agreed to the shita of Rav that a tzuras HaPesach doesn't work for a mavui. After Rav Yochanan savar la lahadirav, 2/3 of the way down Yad Aleph and Aleph, Dama Rabin bar Rav Ada Amar Rav Yitzchak Ma'asev Adamechem Nibikas Beis Chorasan. There was a story of a particular person from a particular place. What did he do? Shenoatz dalad kundesen. He took 4 poles and made a shape out of them on the ground. He made a square. The arba pinos asad at the 4 corners of the field. Matach zemura alein. He took a vine and he stretched it to all 4 in order to make a mini eruv. Says the Gemara, the Chachamim said it's mutter for you to use this as it relates to kilayim, so that with using the principle of pitikra yored v'sosein, if I have this, these 4 walls, they basically drop like lead, and then I could plant 2 things on either side of the wall that would have otherwise been kilayim. But because of the fact that they have the kundation and they have the zamura, because they have this basic system, it's like this is a great precedent for our system that we use for Eruvin in our community, poles with strings on top. So this is a wonderful precedent, and this Gemara, this and the next side in particular, are used in the discussions of whether or not our our Eruvin, our good Eruvin. So that's really what we're discussing here. So that's what the Gemara says is what he did here, and they gave him a heter for a kilayim. Reish Lakish, do we extend this to Shabbos as well? Do we say that if these kundesin and the zamura, these poles and the vines that are on top, do we say that if it's good enough for kilayim, that it's also good enough for Shabbos? That's subject to a machlokas amoraim between Reish Lakish and Rav Yochanan. Let's see what the Gemara says. Says the Gemara 10 lines from the bottom. Beautiful. Reish Lakish makes the jump and he says that just like this works for the world of kilayim, if it works for that, why doesn't it work for this? But yet we'll see the dissenting opinion right now. However, we see that Rav Yochanan is of the opinion that this does not work, that this Tzuras HaPesach system does not work on Shabbos. That is the Shita of Rav. And that's why the Gemara says that the Af Rav Yochanan, even Rav Yochanan holds of the opinion of Rav because of this exact case, where there was a case of Kundesin and Zemora. They had the poles, 1, 2, 3, 4. They strung it from the top, and says Rav Yochanan doesn't work for Shabbos. Why not? Clearly he must hold like Rav, that a Tzuras HaPesach doesn't work for a break of, we'll see exactly how much, of a break in order to make it mutter to carry on Shabbos. So says the Gemara, b'maya askinan. Ilema min hatzad. If you want to say that the zemura, that the line that was on top was not actually on top of the poles, but resting on the outside, let's say you just strung it around the 4 poles. It's not above the pole, but it's on the sides of the pole. So el ilema min hatzad, that can't be, because v'ha'amar Rav Chizda, we'll analyze this more later today, tzuras ha'pesach she'asa min hatzad lo asa v'lo klum. We learned about this yesterday as well in the name of another Amora. What was the language there? A couple blot ago. Says the Gemara, Ba'inan Kora al Gabe Mavui Beleka, that we need that was on the bottom of Daf Chesim Beis, the last line there. What was it in the name of? Let's do it properly. In the name of Rava. So there we said that we need the strings to be on top. So it says the Gemara, if you want to say that this case of Rav Yochanan and Reish Lakish, this case is talking about where the vines are on the side of the poles, that doesn't work because that's a zero, lo asa v'lo klum. So Ella al gaban, it must be that the line was in fact on top of the poles. Let's say from the top of the pole, they hit in, let's say this is a pole, and they hit in do just like this. I got a spoon here, and they have this. So they're perfect. They wrap the string around the top, and then they go to the next. That's perfect. That's exactly how you want to have it. That's a kore al gabe lechi. That's perfect. So that makes perfect sense. So it says the Gemara ela al gaban. It must be that it's talking about that the string was on top of the pole. Uvemai. What are the details? Ilema be'eser. If you want to tell me that it's up to 10, and that Rav Yochanan would still say it doesn't work up to 10. I mean, come on, that's our Mishnah. You don't even have to be Mamayit that Pirza. You don't even need anything for that. Even according to Rav himself, who doesn't like Tzuras HaPesach B'fem Mala, he's admitted to that. Everyone agrees to the opening frame of our Mishnah that if there's a Pirza of less than 10, you're good to go. So that can't be. There's no way that the case we're talking about is where the length and or width of this particular space is less than 10. So it says the Gemara, that can't be. Therefore, 4 lines from the bottom, Elolav, be'yeser me'eser. It must be there. Now we're talking about where it's talking about more than 10. And here we see that Rav Yochanan is exactly like the Shita of Rav, that a Tzuras HaPesach does not work for greater than 10. It says the Gemara, that's not necessarily true. Maybe you can't learn that Rav Yochanan is like Rav from this story. Why not? Because Lolam be'eser, it could be that they're talking about an argument of up to 10, where the right to left, the length and width of this particular kundesin and zemura, where you have this 4 pole and the vines at the top, maybe it is taka less than 10. Why would Rav Yochanan not allow it in this case? It's not because of Tzuras HaPesach, but maybe for another reason. Lo la'olam be'eser umin hatzad ubid Rav Chizda kamiflagei. The Gemara here is making an assertion that maybe really what we're talking about in this case is not about the 10 or more than 10. Maybe it's really all less than 10. But the reason why we have concerns about Shabbos is whether or not we say that min hatzad is good enough. Namely, do we accept the Shita of Rav Chizda that the line has to actually be directly above the pole? Now, just to be super clear, we don't paskin like Rav Chizda. We do paskin like Rav Chizda that the rope has to be directly above the poles. So let's continue. What do we see from here? First of all, we rejected the definitive comparison of Rav Yochanan to Rav. Doesn't mean it's not there. It just means that this source is not a raya. Rav still certainly holds of his opinion, but we don't know if Rav Yochanan yet agrees because we couldn't definitively get this case of the 4 poles with the vines on top to prove clearly that Rav Yochanan Taka held like Rav. All right, let's continue. Says the Gemara, we have a problem. We just learned that in this case of the 4 poles with the Zemura on top, that Reish Lakish was lenient both by Kilayim and by Shabbos. And Rav Yochanan was lenient only by Kilayim, but was Machmir on Shabbos. So that is a problem. Because V'rami de Rav Yochanan ad Rav Yochanan, V'rami de Reish Lakish ad Reish Lakish. We're going to see that we have a stira both internally within Rav Yochanan and as well internally within Rav Ashi. How does this play out? Because Amar Reish Lakish Mishum Rabbi Yehuda Reb Chanina. Rabbi Yehuda Reb Chanina was the Rebbe of Reish Lakish. This will come up very important momentarily. So what do we see? What does the Rebbe of Reish Lakish teach as we turn to the top of Yud Aleph on the base? Says the Gemara, Peya Muteres Lenin Kilayim. Peya here, top Rashi says, Kliyas Hazamura Hamatucha Mikundas Lechavero. This is actually the same case we were talking about before. We're talking about the same case of the 4 poles and the Zemura on top. We're right now right at the top of Yud Aleph on the base at the very top line. So it says the Gemara, what does Reish Lakish hold in the name of his Rebbe? Mutter for Kilayim, aval lo b'Shabbos. That's a stira. Because on the previous page, Reish Lakish was matir. He allowed for this system to be used for Shabbos. Yet here we see it's not. So that's our question of Reish Lakish ad Reish Lakish. The Rav Yochanan Omar. And what does Rav Yochanan say in this same case? Yochanan Omar, ki mechitzos l'Shabbos lo, kach mechitzos l'kilayim lo. He doubles his isurim. Previously, he only said it was usher by Shabbos and mutter by kilayim. Here he says it's usher by everything. Basically, everyone got one level more strict in this new source. So we have source number 1, which was our initial source. And that was the, let's just get the beginning of this Gemara. That was the case that we tried to bring in the name of Rav Yochanan to prove that Rav Yochanan holds like Rav of 4 poles and the Zemura. So there, everyone was more lenient, and here everyone's more strict. So we'll call them source number 1, which was the proof for Rav Yochanan. Source number 2 is Reish Lakish's Rebbe. So source number 1, everyone seemed to be more lenient, and source number 2, everyone's more strict. So it says the Gemara, Rav Yochanan Amar ki mechitzos l'Shabbos delo, kach mechitzos l'kilayim delo, and that's a stira too. But the Gemara has a clean answer for Reish Lakish. Here's the clean answer for Reish Lakish. Says the Gemara, Bishlamad de Reish Lakish, ad Reish Lakish lo kasha. Even though it's true in source number 1, Reish Lakish was lenient both by Kilayim and by Shabbos. And in source number 2, Reish Lakish is lenient only by Kilayim but not by Shabbos. That's not a stira. Why? Hadidei hadarabe. His opinion was the one in source number 1. He, in and of himself, as a Talmud Chacham, he was of the opinion that both are mutter, that once you build these poles with the Zemura on top, the din is that it's mutter both for Kilayim and for Shabbos. Masha'en came here, as mentioned, that this brisa was mentioned in the name of his Rebbe. It's not, I don't know if it's a brisa actually, but it was quoted in the name of his Rebbe, Rabbi Yehuda Reb Chanina, where he was more machmir to say that it's only mutter by Kilayim, but it's not mutter by Shabbos. Rav Yochanan Kasha. We can't give the same answer for Rav Yochanan because this Mare Makom was from the Rebbe of Reish Lakish. So what would Rav Yochanan say? If you want to argue Hasam al Gaban Hachaminatzad, if you want to argue that there's a difference in the cases. In one case, we say that the line was al Gaban, that the Zemura was on top of the poles. The Hacha, and in another case, he wants to say it's Minatzad Shapir. Then I could understand why Shmuel in source number 1 would be more lenient because the line was on top. Still not good enough for Shabbos, but good enough for Kilayim. And in this case, it's Minatzad. In source number 2 at the top of this page, it's Minatzad. And therefore, Rav Yochanan has no space in his mind for leniency. But if you want to say, like you recommended, was maybe the machlokes on the bottom of the previous page, that everything was on the side, if that's what you want to say, you got to give me a good source for that. Says the Gemara, here's how I'll answer you. The first of the longest lines, 6 lines down. Really, source 1 and source number 2 for Rav Yochanan are talking about where the vine is wrapped to the outside of the poles and not on top where it should be. Hasam ve'eser. In source number 1, where Reish Lakish was willing to be lenient by the Kilayim but not by Shabbos, there was less than 10. Hacha, in this case, in source number 2, where he shuts down both Kilayim and Shabbos, Hacha v'yoser me'eser. Very good. So says the Gemara, what's the precedent for such a distinction? that when something is min hatzad, that there's a difference between less than 10 and more than 10. Uminat timra, where do we see Amari Makom, where we are able to distinguish between less than 10 and more than 10 as it relates to min hatzad, like Rav Yochanan wants to answer, or like we're answering for Rav Yochanan? Answers the Gemara, Da'amar le Rav Yochanan the Reish Lakish. Rav Yochanan says to Reish Lakish as follows. Lo kachaya maisa, wasn't there a story? Shahalach Rav Yeshua Eitzel Rav Yochanan ben Nuri lilmod Torah. Rav Yeshua, who went to where? Shahalach Rav Yeshua. Rav Yeshua went to go learn by Rav Yochanan ben Nuri. Afal pi shabaki behilchos kilayim, even though he himself was very well versed with the world of kilayim. Umetzao sheyoshe ben ha'ilanos. He saw he was sitting outside in an orchard. And he had this exact structure. This is now source number 3. He had this exact structure of poles with a zamura, poles with a line stretched from top to top. With these vines, if you have a vineyard over here, am I allowed to plant outside of this line? How does this work for kilayim, namely? So what does he say back to him? Amar lo, be'eser muter, be'yoser me'eser aser. Ah, beautiful. So now we see our distinction of 10 and 10, of before 10 and of less than 10 and more than 10. So this still functions as a good answer for our stira internally within Rav Yochanan that we had at the top of the page. It says the Gemara, well, it's not yet totally comparable because the space in which we utilize this answer of before 10, of less than 10 and more than 10 was when the line was on the side, not when the line was on top. So we need to confirm that that's what was going on with this case of Rav Yochanan ben Nuri. So it says the Gemara, B'maya skinan, ilema al gaban. If you want to say that it's that the line was on top, so then yoser me'eser aser. We should not say that more than 10 is problematic if it's on a vine. Why? We should not say that more than 10 is problematic if the line is on top of the actual pole. V'atanya, we have a brisa. Hayusham kanim hadokranim v'asa lahen peya milmala. You have these poles and you put strings on top of them. Afilu biyoser me'eser motor v'mafurash brisa. This is what our Eruvin rely upon. This exact quote from the Gemara is how our Eruvin are built. You have poles. You have lines that are on top of them. You are allowed to exceed 10 amos happily, no problem at all. So that can't be that what we're talking about. It can't be that the case that we're discussing in the Gemara with Rav Yochanan ben Nuri here is a case where the line was on top of the poles, because if so, the distinction of less than 10 and more than 10 wouldn't apply. Ela lav min hatzad b'ka'amar le be'eser muter yos me'eser aser shmamina. Rather, we have a perfect precedent for the answer that we gave for Rav Yochanan, which is that we're talking about min hatzad. We're talking about where the rope is not on top, but rather to the sides of the poles, and we see that there is a distinction of less than 10, which is mutter, and more than 10, which is aser, and that works perfectly, perfect precedent for the shita of Rav Yochanan. Let's continue at the 2 dots, 1/3 of the way down, just another third of the page to go until we get to the Mishnah. Gufa, we learned this line a little bit earlier. Amar Rav Chizda tzuras haPesach she'asa min hatzad lo asa v'lo klum. If you're making a tzuras haPesach and the top of the tzuras haPesach is not over the poles, you got nothing going for you. It's a 0. The Amar Rav Chizda tzuras haPesach she'amru. This tzuras haPesach that we're in discussion about, where the top has to be above the poles, tzricha shetehei bria. It has to be healthy. The tzuras haPesach can't be flimsy. What does it have to be able to tolerate, to withstand? It has to be able to hold a door. What kind of door? Even if it's made out of wicker, it's made out of straw, something lightweight. But it's got to hold a good few pounds. It can't be this flimsy piece of garbage that's not going to be able to hold up anything. Otherwise, what's the point? It has to be able to withstand something. It has to be strong enough to hold something. Doesn't mean you need a door in it. A tzuras haPesach by its nature doesn't have to have a door. It just has to be able to hold the door. Not only that, Amar Reish Lakish Mishum Rav Yanai tzuras haPesach tzricha heker tzir. Not only that, but this also needs to have some type of hinge. My heker tzir, Amar Rav Avya avkasa. What's avkasa? Take a look at Rashi. About 3-4 inches above where we are, Dibur hamaskal avkasa. Chor, it's a hole. Shetzir hadeles sovev bo. Just like our hinges, you have a piece in the door, and you have a piece in the wall, and they intersect, and you can place something to hold them together to allow the door to swivel. So it says the Gemara, you need that in your tzuras haPesach as well. Good. Amar, where are we? Here we go. Ashkechinhu Rav Acha berei de Rav Avia l'talmidei de Rav Ashi. Rav Acha, the son of Rav Avia, found some of the Talmidim of Rav Ashi, and he wanted to talk and learning with them. Amar lahu, he said to the Talmidim, Amar marmidi b'tzuras haPesach, did your Rebbe Rav Ashi teach you anything about tzuras haPesach that you could teach me? Amru le lo amar v'lo klum. He didn't teach us anything. Tana, and then there's an additional language here. Amar lahu, he said back to them, Tana tzuras haPesach she'amru kana mikan v'kana mikan v'kana al gabehen. Did he at least teach you the basics? We know that that's true, that the way we define a tzuras haPesach is a kana over here and a kana over there and something going across the top. That's the simplest stuff. Come on. Tzrichin liga o ein tzrichin liga. When we have these two poles, does it have to be the case that the two poles are connected to one another, where they're directly touching, or can it be above, where the space, the line in both directions is perfectly aligned, but it doesn't have to necessarily touch? Can it be lofted above the poles? That's the Gemara's question that we're asking right now, is does the top of the tzuras haPesach have to actually touch the poles? Rav Nachman Amar Ein Tzrichin Liga. Rav Nachman says, no, they don't. As long as they're directly above, no problem at all. Rav Sheshes Amar Tzrichin Liga. Machlokes Amoraim. We paskin like Rav Nachman, that it's the top of a tzuras haPesach does not need to touch the posts of the door. It can be held above and still be deemed a tzuras haPesach. Fascinating story. Also Rav Nachman, who held of his own opinion that the tzuras haPesach does not need to touch the posts. And he did what he thought was mutter, and within the Daled Amos of the Reish Galusa, of the local head of government of the local exilarch. Amarle Rav Sheshes Lashami, Rav Sheshes, who was the contrarian, who did not agree with the opinion of Rav Nachman. Amarle Rav Sheshes Lashami Rav Gada, he said to his servant, whose name was Rav Gada, Zil Shalav Shadinu, you need to go take down Rav Nachman's tzuras haPesach. It's not kosher, because Rav Sheshes was of the opinion that the top of the door has to be touching the posts. So the servant was a good servant. He did what he was supposed to do. Azal Shalav Shadinu. And then Ashkechu de Reish Galusa, the people in the Reish Galusa's house saw that the tzuras haPesach was knocked down, and they found out who the culprit was, and Chavshu, they put him in the local prison. A chutzpah, you're tearing down the doors just because you don't agree. What are you doing? Azal Rav Sheshes kam abava. Rav Sheshes was in prison, and he walked over to the door of his jail cell. Amar le Gada Pokta, can you please get me out of here? Nafak ve'asa, he dropped bail, and he got out of jail. Ashkeche Rav Sheshes le Rabbi Bar Shmuel. Rav Sheshes was let out of jail, and he bumped into Rabbi Bar Shmuel. Amar le Tani Mar Midi b'tzuras haPesach. Can you teach me some Torah? Did your master teach you anything in regards to a tzuras haPesach? Amar le In, yes, he did. He taught me about a case of Tanina Kippah, a case where we have a door in the shape of a dome. Sometimes we see these in fancier homes, and we see them also in like old school homes that are made out of stone. In Israel, the Italian Baroque style has this a lot, where the doorways are completely arched. Right? So how do we look at that in halacha? So does that require a mezuzah? Does that not require a mezuzah? And this, of course, relates to the sugya of tzuras haPesach, because as we know, the mitzvah d'oraisa of a mezuzah is to put a mezuzah where there is a tzuras haPesach. L'dugma, I have in my house the entrance from my den into my kitchen. There are two walls, like regular width walls, whatever they are, but it goes flush to the ceiling. The ceiling at the top is flush with no bump. There's nothing that drops down by the door. So I didn't know what I was talking about. I bought a mezuzah. I didn't make a bracha on that one because I wasn't sure, but I just put one up anyways. And then I had my mezuzah checked a year ago, and he took it down, and he said there's no mitzvah for mezuzah there. So how do we define a tzuras haPesach when that tzuras haPesach is an archway where the top of the door is not rectangular, but rather the top of the door is rounded? So it says the Gemara 2/3 of the way down in Yud Aleph Amud Beis. But Meir Mechai b'mezuzah, when it's domed at the top, when it's rounded at the top, that is still called a tzuras haPesach. The Chachamim Potren, the Chachamim were of the opinion that it is exempt. Good. The Shavin, and they agree in the following different scenarios. When do Rav Meir and the Chachamim agree? If there is if the first 3 tfachim from the ground are straight, and then the rest extends up in rounds, that's good. That's good. Then we would say that you are a chayev. That's number 1. Amar Abaye, Hakol Modim as well. Everyone would agree to the following: Im Gavoa Asara. If the height from the peak of the arch right up here down to the bottom is 10 tfachim, sheyesh beragleha asara, she chayebes. Im Gavoa Asara ve'ein beragleha shlosha. If it is 10 from top to bottom, but the first 3 tfachim are not straight, Inami yesh b'raglei shlosha ve'ein gvoa asara. Or there are the first three on the ground. The first three tefachim are straight, but that doesn't have a height of 10 till the peak of the dome. Below klim, everyone agrees that's 0. Ki pligi. When do Rav Meir and the Chachamim argue in regards to this case of kippah, of this domed doorway? Ki pligi v'yesh b'raglei hagimel, where there is a height of 3 on each side of the wall. The first 3 tefachim from the ground are built properly. Let's see, v'gavoa asara, and from the floor to the peak of the dome is 10. Ve'ein rechava arba'a, but it's not 4 wide the whole place, but you theoretically could carve it out. Meaning there's enough wall that you could, in theory, let's say the wall kind of curves quickly. So if there's enough wall to chisel out and make that squared out, so then that's what we call chokukin lahashlim. We've learned about this a number of times already. And that is subject to the machlokas Rav Meir and the Chachamim. So do we say that if it's in theory possible to carve out the brick, to carve out the wall, to build it out to be 4 wide for the first 3 tefachim, so would we then say that that is sufficient to be considered a space where you would put a mezuzah midoraisa? So it says the Gemara, Rav Meir savar chokukin lahashlim. Rav Meir is of the opinion that we would put a mezuzah there, even though the first 3 tefachim already taper in, and by the top part of the 3 tefachim, it's less than 4 tefachim wide, so that's not a door anymore. But because there's more wall where in theory I could carve and open it out like this, so therefore Rav Meir is of the opinion you should put up a mezuzah. The Rabbanan Sabre, the Chachamim argue, ein chokukin lahashlim. They're of the opinion that no, the wall is the way that it is. If within the first 3 tefachim from the ground, the wall tapers in such a way, let's say the top of my fingers are 3 tefachim from the ground here, and it just tilts enough so that in between my fingertips it's not 4 tefachim, you're just done for. Chokukin lahashlim, we're not carving out a wall, we're not even conceptually carving out a wall. That door jamb does not need a mezuzah. That's the shita of the Chachamim. And after Rav Shesh's bad experience with the Reish Galusa, he gives a little political fair warning to his chaver who he was talking and learning with. He says, Amar lei, imishkachas lahu, lo tema lahu lebei Reish Galusa v'lo midi meha masnisa de kippah. Don't talk to him about this. Don't talk to him about mezuzahs. Don't talk to him about Tzuras HaPesach. He's very sensitive about the whole deal. He even put me in jail. We're going to stop here at the Mishnah, Mir Hashem, on Shabbos. We will learn Daf Yud Beis and Yud Gimel Amud Aleph. On Sunday night, we will learn Yud Gimel Amud Beis and Yud Daled, and then we will be all caught up. Wishing you all a beautiful Shabbos. A special thank you to my wife, who was very helpful and supportive during our vacation to give me the time to learn, to prepare, and to give Daf Yomi as well. A big yasher koach to her. Thank her very much. That's all for tonight. We'll pick up in Mir Hashem on Shabbos at an hour before Mincha.
So,
Baruch Tiyeh. Thank you.
Phil, the WhatsApps I'm sending you, is that all? Do you enjoy it? Do you like it? Do you want it, or that's about it?
I'm on vacation. I'm trying to minimize my exposure. So
no, well, that's for it's regarding the daf. That's why.
Yeah, I'll look at it. I didn't even look at it. I didn't open any of the files. So I'm just trying to avoid my all of my work external needs. But I'll take a look at it at another time.
It's regarding the daf. It's not work. It's regarding the daf. So that's why,
Thank you very much. I'll take a look at it.
Okay.
Okay. Cool too. Have a good night.